gambit has failed, giver of eternity. Baldur's Gate still stands strong.
And what of Mordok, priest?
Utterly destroyed Almighty Pharaoh in an attempt to hold the tower.
His failure cannot be allowed to hamper my sacred mission. We will leave Mulholland and see to the matter ourselves. Raise the tomb soldiers and prepare my sun barge.
As my God King demands.
Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance was one of my favorite hack-and-slash ARPG series from the early 2000s. It combined great gameplay with D&D mechanics and RPG elements, and had a huge swath of lore to back it all up. The series sold pretty well, and was loved by Forgotten Realms and ARPG fans alike. The interesting thing is, the second game, Dark Alliance 2, had an unexpected ending, where after you kill the last boss, the guy who you thought was the big bad guy in charge of everything, you find out that they were really just a pawn of this unseen Egyptian-themed villain in a sarcophagus. So really, the game ends on a cliffhanger, and we all eagerly anticipated a third game. So what happened? Why was Dark Alliance 3 never made? In this episode of Games That Never Existed, I'm going to do three things. First of all, I'm going to tell you the history of Dark Alliance 3. Second, I'm going to explain what I think the game would have looked like if ever developed. Finally, I'm going to talk about whether I think this game will ever be made in the future. And guys, in my opinion, the last section of this video is probably the most interesting, so make sure to stick around for that. And without further ado, let's get into this.
Welcome, my friends. Your presence means I can count Eldrith dead.
It all began with a little game developer called Black Isle Studios. Now, if you've followed my channel before, this probably won't be the first time you've heard me talk about Black Isle. And Black Isle was involved in many games throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, but one of the last games they made was Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 2, the game with the aforementioned cliffhanger ending. After all was said and done, by 2003, Black Isle was working on a few different games, but the one we're focusing on today is of course Dark Alliance 3. Now before we go much further, I should mention that unfortunately, Black Isle had the misfortune of having a crappy parent company by the name of Interplay. Once again, if you followed my channel before, this is not the first time you've heard me talk about Interplay. Now Interplay has a history of mismanaging funds and barely dodging bankruptcies. So while Black Isle themselves were doing great and making games that sold very well and everyone loved, Interplay, of course, was falling apart like usual. This came to a head in December of 2003 when Interplay abruptly closed Black Isle and fired all of its employees, very suddenly ending all of their projects. As a result, all the games they were working on got cancelled, including Dark Alliance 3. Two of the other games they were developing, Fallout 3 and Baldur's Gate 3, were both eventually picked up and continued by other studios. And we now know that Black Isle had made at least some progress with Fallout 3 because they made a demo for it. But Dark Alliance 3? Well, we don't really know anything about it. There's very little information out there. So that's it. Or so it seems. We don't have any information on this game. Now there are some tidbits and ancillary information that I'm going to discuss in part 3 of this video, but for now we're going to move on to part 2.
Centuries of conquest and scattered settlements have done nothing to tame the monster-filled reaches of the Western Heartlands. Perhaps it is for this reason that the realm welcomes ambitious adventurers, and Baldur's Gate, its greatest city, calls to them like a siren luring mariners to their doom.
So as for the game itself, what would it be like? Well, of course, I can't say for sure, given that I don't have insider information, but I can try to make some educated guesses based on what we know about Dark Alliance. First of all, I think that multiplayer would definitely be a big part of this game, both local co-op and probably online multiplayer too, seeing how the technology has gotten much better over the years and it probably wouldn't be too hard to implement. Also, I know that Dark Alliance's game mechanics were based on an older edition of D&D, so I'd imagine that with a third game, they'd update all the mechanics to 5th edition rules, along with using a new game engine. As for the game's story, I really can't comment too much on it because we really don't know much about it. However, we can gather a couple of things from the ending of Dark Alliance 2, based on the way that the priest addresses the man in the sarcophagus, calling him a god king and pharaoh, and furthermore, saying how they will leave Mulhorand. It's possible that this unknown figure is one of the pharaohs of Mulhorand, possibly Horostep III, who, according to the Forgotten Realms wiki, was the pharaoh around the time of Dark Alliance. Now, as for why this pharaoh wanted to destroy Baldur's Gate, I really have no idea, because as far as I can tell, Mulhorand never really had much of a conflict with Baldur's Gate, so I'm really curious as to what Black Isle were thinking of with this storyline. Sadly, we'll probably never know what those original plans were. Of course, the game could go in a lot of directions, because the lore of Forgotten Realms is so vast and deep that it gives the developers a lot of wiggle room, but that also means it's hard to guess about the storylines because almost literally anything could happen. Now, as for the future status of this game, that's where things get really interesting. We know this game's been dead and gone for a long time with no news, but while Dark Alliance may be forgotten, Baldur's Gate 3, one of the other Black Isle originals, is being made by Larian Studios. So since it seems there's newfound interest for Baldur's Gate, and seeing how Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance is an offshoot of the original games, it makes it seem more likely that enough interest in Baldur's Gate 3 could also stir up some interest for a Dark Alliance 3. And as for Dark Alliance 3 itself, there's another bit of trivia here. While the game's history seems to end after 2003's closure of Black Isle Studios, the Dark Alliance license and rights itself has an interesting history to it, and I'll explain why this is important in a minute. The original Dark Alliance game was not made by Black Isle, but another developer that Interplay hired named Snowblind Studios. And Snowblind made the Dark Alliance engine that was used for Dark Alliance 1 and 2, Champions of Norath, and some other action games of similar caliber. It turns out that Interplay was producing games, like Dark Alliance 2, using Snowblind's Dark Alliance engine without their permission and without giving Snowblind any royalties from using said engine. Good old Interplay, taking one step forward and 5 steps backwards as always. Anyway, Snowblind ended up suing Interplay because of this, obviously, and one of the results of this lawsuit was that Snowblind was granted the Dark Alliance license, allowing them to make a Dark Alliance game within a certain amount of time. However, the contract dictated that if Snowblind didn't enter into an agreement with Interplay to create a new Dark Alliance game within 2 years of this contract, then the rights would just be given back to Interplay. So it seems that most likely Interplay probably ended up getting the rights back to Dark Alliance sometime in 2007, given how this lawsuit happened and was settled in 2005. Now, you may be wondering why this boring lawsuit stuff is important to the future of Dark Alliance 3, but this is important to bring up because it shows that Interplay has a lot of trouble controlling their licenses, and also just shows that they're a really crappy company. And since the company has continued to have a rocky history monetarily, it's not completely impossible that maybe they even sold the license off to someone else, given how it seems like they're constantly running out of cash. But then again, that's just speculation. Of course, I don't know for sure. So then, my best guess is that Interplay still probably had the Dark Alliance rights in its possession, that is if they didn't sell it or lose it, but haven't done anything with these rights since. Which kind of makes sense given that Interplay is a dumpster fire of a company, and honestly, I'm not sure if they're in a great position to be drumming up old IPs like this again. So, it's definitely possible that Interplay will see Baldur's Gate 3 perform well and decide to hop on the hype train and try to stir up some revenue by making a Dark Alliance 3, but the thing is there are a lot of potential variables affecting the return of this series, such as, does Interplay even still have the license? Do they have the money to make another game? Do they care enough to make another game? I don't know. But perhaps, with the resurrection of Baldur's Gate, maybe Dark Alliance 2 can rise from the ashes and save us all from the tyranny of Path of Exile. I'm just kidding, guys. Path of Exile is actually a fun game. I don't have anything against it, but I do want a Dark Alliance 3 to be made. And I hope that someday we'll see its triumphant return, and maybe, just maybe, Baldur's Gate 3 can help that along. As always, if you like hearing me ramble on about dead companies and old games, make sure to subscribe.